If a client is going to be completely hands-off, I never hear from them, and I can do everything and it takes me 10 hours, easy. They get billed for 10 hours. If a client's going to message me 17 times a day, change their mind 400 times, and it takes me 100 hours for the same project, it's only fair that they get billed for that 100 hours. I can't bill 10 hours for both projects because one took me way longer than the other.
Welcome to the Design Table podcast. I am so excited because I have Marcus, a very talented designer. He is a founder and principal of Conik Studios, and he's been in the industry for over 10 years. So we're going to get all of the insights and all of the details into how his journey began and how he is here today, killing it at amazing interior design projects. Welcome to the Design Table, Marcus.
Thank you for having me.
How's everything going?
It's good. It's a snowy day, but we're making it work.
That's what Canada is lovely for. And just before we started recording, I know you mentioned you were in Vegas for a show, so talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so 2 weeks ago I was in Vegas for KBIS, which is the kitchen and bath industry show, and then I was also there for the Vegas Furniture Market, which is kind of an introduction to High Point, which is the larger furniture market in April. So I was there for 8 days. They were two incredible shows, lots to see. So yeah, it was great. And then following that, I headed to New York to meet with a couple clients. And
so busy traveling everywhere. And it's good you mentioned about the shows because a lot of our audience are people who are just starting out in the design field or they're starting their businesses. And one of the questions they always wonder is, are these shows valuable? Should they be visiting them earlier on in their career, or should they maybe, soak in a little bit more experience before they head to these shows? So what kind of value would you say these designers can benefit from?
From going to the shows, I feel like it's great to go to them, even if you're new in the industry, because it's a way to meet the people that are going to support you in your career, like reps for different brands. They're great networking opportunities because usually there's like a cocktail hour or something where you can meet other designers or builders or whoever is going to kind of support you and maybe give you work when you're starting your career. So those are always great things to do. And
you mentioned networking, which is a good point because you and I met through one of these shows, and that's the biggest benefit of just being at the right place at the right time. Like, you connect with different people. You might not necessarily get any sale or job out of it, but you never know what that relationship can turn into in the future. So from a networking perspective, like, it's definitely good as you're early on in your career, and then later on, as you feel comfortable, you can keep revisiting the shows and whatnot. One thing I want to start talking to you about is interior design and interior decoration, because you went to a school here and you have your interior design degree, but there is a little bit of confusion around the two terms or understanding what path can a certain person take. And you also come from an arts background, so you can talk a little bit about that, which is really cool, and see how your journey led to you being your own founder and your own business owner.
Yeah, so I guess my journey, I was always a creative person growing up through elementary school and high school and all of that. I was involved in musical theater and was always more of a creative type. So finding a career that kind of lent itself to was important to me. Like, there's always an artist or a musician and things like that I could have kind of followed the path, but I stumbled into interior design, and I actually stumbled across the program that I ended up taking, the Conestoga Interior Design program. It kind of felt like the perfect blend, and there is another program at Conestoga College that's an interior decorating program. And an interior decorating program can still be a diploma, but an interior design is now a degree program.
So do you have other team members that you work with in your business, and do they all consider themselves as interior designers, or is it like, what is the requirement there if people wanted to take on design projects?
Yeah, so not necessarily. I don't really have any full-time employees. I have a lot of support that kind of helps me part-time. And some of that is students. A lot of the times interior design programs are co-op, so you're able to kind of hire in students so that they get some real life working experience while they're in school. Because I did go to Conestoga, I've kind of included a couple people that are currently in the design program.
Yeah, that's a really good strategy.
Exactly. They're learning, but they're kind of easy to train, and they know what they know, because they have a similar training to what I do. And then around me, I have other people like engineers and architects and builders who all have different kind of stems of training, but we all kind of complement each other.
Right. And that's a good point, because one of the questions that we get asked is, well, I, did so-and-so, or I'm international and I did my schooling from overseas and now I'm coming to Canada and I'm not sure if I'm qualified to take on design projects, right? And I guess my response usually is, well, even if you're not qualified, you can still take the jobs on, because more than you are a designer, you are a business owner, and that means you are a sales agent of your company. So you need to get those projects, and if there's a structural or an architectural based decision that needs to be made, you can source that elsewhere and bring an engineer in and whatever.
Exactly.
So in your experience, as you take jobs on, how often do you do that, and like what that step looks like for you, I guess?
It depends on the project size. Like I kind of range in project size from, like, it could be a bathroom renovation, it could be a home remodel, like full addition, and it can be a new build. So typically in the larger scale projects like an addition or a full interior renovation where you're changing floor plan layouts and new builds, there's a full team involved of architects and engineers and whatever else may be included, landscape architects. All of these people kind of work together to create the full package so that the home can be built.
Right.
And then in smaller renovations, it may be that I'm doing the drawings, saying, yeah, I want to move this wall, and making those types of recommendations, but I always have an engineer, whether it's a structural engineer or a consultant, whatever it may be. I'll have them come into process, and they can actually annotate our drawings so that they don't have to do a full-scale package, and they can tell you where the posts and beams are and all of that kind of stuff. So it really depends on the scale of projects, how involved different kind of
but it's totally normal for people to do that, right? Because sometimes the fear is, I don't know if I can manage this entire project on my own, but it's like, well, you can always, get that support system, which you were saying, and rely on that. It's not like this, like be it end all kind of situation.
No. And I think interior design is one of those things where, like, there's a lot of really successful interior designers that don't necessarily have an interior design degree. They've learned through practice and all of those types of things. So interior design is something that you can learn without the education, but there may be components of it that you do need additional support on.
Right.
And there's a lot of really successful designers out there that don't have formal interior design training.
But they're running massive design businesses.
Exactly.
And that's the whole conversation around being an entrepreneur and business owner, is that you need to have that really sorted out before you can even do the design work. Like I say this even with other guests that come on, we're problem solvers first and foremost, and 90% of the time our job is running our business. Maybe the little time that I get, I'm like, let me pick a tile for my client and see how that works, and usually it's just figuring out, okay, when do we do the purchasing and procurement, and how do we do invoicing and things like that, which is a huge part of kind of what you and I do.
That process is huge. Like having a proper process that you can follow along and is kind of, you can put into every project, so you don't have to rebuild every single time you're going into a project. It's super beneficial. And
you mentioned a little bit of jargon right before we started. We talked about the different accreditations, so I want to also touch a little bit on that. So we have ARIDO, we have NCIDQ, and then we have a new term that you told me about, which I didn't even know, which was CI something?
No, it's CETA.
CETA, that's right. So let's go through each one and see what that means and how they're different from each other.
Yeah, so in terms of like accredited associations for interior designers, there's a bunch of them, but there's ARIDO, which is Ontario-based. It's the Association of Registered Interior Designers. So that's provincial. We have DDA, which is Designer and Decorators of Canada. So that's all of Canada. There's NKBA, which is the National Kitchen and Bath Association.
Okay. Do you need to be like licensed for that or registered?
NKBA. Or you need to register to be like a member of NKBA. So it's another like DDA association.
Got it. Okay.
And they're all great. They all host different kind of events and networking things, and CEUs, which is another part of education that we all have. As an accredited interior designer, we have to maintain a certain number of credits per year from different kind of, like, brands will host a lunch and learn or something along those lines that you get a credit for, and you need to get a certain amount of credits every year.
Okay. So I didn't know about the credits, like you need to rack up some things. So when it comes to you giving your NCIDQ exam, there's a certain amount of work experience that is required, right?
So NCIDQ, so in education, there's kind of a little bit of a learning curve because we get introduced to ARIDO because we're going to school in Ontario. ARIDO is quite involved in the education process, and NCIDQ is a requirement to be an ARIDO member. To write NCIDQ, you don't have to be an ARIDO member. So you
okay.
can
I thought
you can write NCIDQ without,
because it's Canada wide.
It's
right?
international.
It's
the US writes NCIDQ as well.
Okay.
Yeah. So NCIDQ is basically a training exam. It focuses heavily more so, like, it doesn't focus a lot on residential. It's more so the commercial, hospitality, and healthcare sectors. It's a test in kind of your problem-solving skills and your code knowledge, building code knowledge, all of those types of things. It's more so that, like, there's a practical exam portion, and then there's kind of a multiple choice exam portion.
So people who are wanting to work on, like you said, the hospitality, like restaurants and hotels, this is a path that they can take. And I guess the reason why I talk about this is because in the world of interior design, there's so many things you can do, right? You can be that type of designer who literally just does color consultations and then calls it a day.
Exactly.
You know, because when you go on Etsy, that online platform, you see packages like that where there's designers who've had their shops open for years and they're just doing color consultations and maybe furniture selection. So when people ask me if they need to have their Rito or if they need to have NCID, I always ask them first, what's your end goal? Yeah. So if you're someone who really wants to work on restaurants and like hotels, because have the building code really understood really well, you need to know fire hazards, and you're hosting public in these spaces, so you need to know what you're doing. Yeah,
there's a lot of liability that's involved in kind of in projects that aren't, like, obviously there's liabilities in residential, but they seem to be a lot larger in commercial projects. But NCIDQ, the nice thing about it is that usually if you are getting involved in commercial or hospitality or healthcare, those are usually, you're not usually like a sole proprietor or a small company. It's usually a much larger company that has 100 employees and everybody's kind of working together to create like a hotel or a large restaurant chain or whatever it may be. And usually those companies will support their staff to go through the process of studying for NCIDQ, because it's an expensive exam. I think it's like $1,200. It's not cheap. So usually larger companies like that will pay for that exam for you if, like, you're working for them.
And I think this is equivalent to, let's say, an engineer who's working in a large firm and they want to get their PEng. So the team in the company will support them, sometimes even pay for that. And so I think that's a really good comparison. So we can move over to a little bit more fun stuff. So we talked about all the technical things, and I want to talk a little bit about you, because you started working for a builder, and that's where you gained a lot of your practical knowledge, which is amazing. And then you were like, I want to do design on my own. So tell us a little bit about what kind of skill set you learned working with them, what were some of the challenges, and how good those challenges were for your progress as you became your own business owner.
Yeah, so I didn't go the route, like, after graduating, I went right into working for a builder. I've never really worked for another interior design firm, which is kind of a blessing and a curse, because I think I learned a little, like, I didn't learn as much about the interior design business, but I learned a lot of the practical experience that comes along with interior design, like the site work, which is something you don't necessarily get in school.
Not at all.
So you're like, I can do the plans, but it's like putting those plans into action, kind of.
And things never go right. Exactly. You know, those plans that you're making in class, that's never going to happen in real life.
We always used to laugh, because at the time when we were in school, we'd be like, oh, these professors are so hard on us. They want us to change this. And it's like, that's a client. That's what they do.
That's true.
So it's great experience, but going with a builder, I learned a lot more of the building process and how things get put together. And I'm a very, like, tactile person. I want to know, like, if I'm designing something, like, how is that going to be built? Is it possible that it's going to be built? Because feasibility is another huge part of our industry, where it's like, I can design this wild thing or this crazy kind of contraption that, like, floats in the middle of the room, but how is that actually going to get built? And that was kind of my reasoning for going with a builder, is because I could learn some of that.
And that, I think, is so invaluable, because you, like you said, if you were working for a design firm, you would never get that exposure at all.
You get, like, as an interior designer now, like, because I'm not working for a builder, I do, like, do my site visits, and I see kind of, like, the different stages, but I'm not on site every day learning those little kind of intricacies that happen every day, like with project management and budgeting and all of those types of things, which was another huge thing, was understanding, like, full construction budgets versus interior design budgets.
Let's talk a little bit more about that, because we want to learn what the difference is. And sometimes people, I guess, when you're starting your process and your business, the client asks you, oh, like, what budget am I looking at? And then people don't understand, well, the budget, do you mean like construction budget, or do you mean my design fees budget? Like, how do you differentiate that?
That's always a really complicated question, because a lot of people do it it differently, and it's not something that's standardized in our industry at all.
Yeah, I think
so. That's the
so
biggest
hard.
problem.
Yeah. Pricing and budget is not standardized. I think
Not
that's
at
a
all.
really way to say it. Yeah.
There's no standard way to put it, so that becomes a problem when you're bidding on a project and there may be 2 or 3 designers that are bidding on a project. That client is going to see 3 different proposals and not a single one of them is going to be similar. They may be both hourly based, but the way they're billed, what's being billed for, there's so many different ways that things can be done, so that's a huge portion, and that's just the interior design portion. And the tricky part of that is the client has to kind of manage both sides, where they're like, this is my fees budget, where it's like
to pay the designer,
right. Engineer, architects,
Right.
all of those things, where it's like, that's just fees. There's like, you get a deliverable that may be like an architectural package or an interior design package. But in terms of the actual construction budget, that's always the tricky part.
especially after COVID, where so many variables have changed. Price of lumber has gone up, you know, and now they've
Everything's
gone down.
Yeah.
Actually, lumber
Yeah.
has gone down, but it's like you could have priced a project earlier of this year, and then later on in the year, the price is no longer the same. It happens with plumbing fixtures all the time.
Well, and it's not even like, it used to be like we would get a few months heads up that there's going to be a price increase, or they would give us like the year before, they'd be like, in January there's going to be a price increase.
But now they just
it's
say,
like I could call on a Tuesday and a Friday and the price is different.
Yep, 100%, which is so annoying.
It's really hard, and to get that by a client is impossible because they don't understand.
Yeah, and the other day I was doing Cambria countertops, and I got a quote, and they sent me back saying, 14-day validity. I'm like, my client is not going to make a decision in 14 days about like 20,000 more that they're about to spend on their countertops, right?
Because it's not just that countertop, it's how the countertop goes with the cabinets and the hardware, and you want to put together the whole package. It's
and the holes and where they're going to be drilled.
Exactly. It's like you can't do that all in like a 14-day period. Like interior design is quite a lengthy process from start to finish, and that's another piece that people don't understand always.
So in this situation, what can you advise people, like if they have these variables in place, and of course you have your own business, how do you tackle something like that when you are proposing a construction budget? Is there like some fine print that you say, like how do you manage that expectation with your client so that the client is not getting bad news every 2 days and they're like, you're just ripping me off when you're not?
Exactly. So a lot of it comes down to pre-planning. So when a client first, like in terms of process, if a client comes to me and they haven't engaged a builder, or they don't have anybody else involved, they're coming to me with a project and they're like, I have $500,000 to spend. You kind of have to break that down for them, because they're like, $500,000 is going to do my renovation. It's like, but really you may only have $400,000 because you're going to have $100,000 in fees. So you kind of have to help them to understand that, because it's not something that HGTV teaches you. Everything is free on HGTV. So it's like, it's one of those things that you kind of have to educate your client on.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, and then breaking out, you may not be breaking down that $400,000 into each individual category, like lumber and all those types of things. Usually a builder would do that, but you still have to break down that there's going to be the rough costs of construction, and then there's going to be your furniture budgets, and then there's going to be fixtures, and there's going to be fees, and there's going to be all of these unknowns. And I've put that into our contract now. It was something that I actually added during COVID because I got into a little bit of a trouble on a project. Things didn't show up, and then I was liable for those things. Like the client's like, I'm not going to pay for something that didn't show up, and I'm like, I don't want to pay for something that didn't show up.
It's so funny you say that, because my contract is like 4 or 5 pages long, and it's because every single time I take on a project, I learn something new. It's never the same glove fits all. Every time there's like you mentioned with the furniture, well, now I have a contract clause too. If you don't respond to me in 1 week and the furniture piece goes out of stock, well, guess what? I'm not spending 5 hours sourcing another one unpaid, you know?
Exactly. And that's kind of, I had to put that in general. Like I've had to say, like, especially with furniture orders, when you're ordering things like 6 months in advance, and it's like, it's in stock, and then it's like, okay, I need to fulfill that order now. The client's moving in a month. I need it by next week or whenever it is, and it should be in stock because you ordered it 6 months ago, and whoever the supplier is, you'll call them and they're like, oh, we actually sold that last week, we're not going to get another one for another 6 weeks.
Oh, I get this all the time. Oh my goodness. And you have to deal with that situation with your client, but again, that's the thing, right? We're not designers, we're problem solvers.
Exactly. But that comes into like the kind of gray area where a client's like, am I being charged because like that person screwed something up? Like the fact that I'm gonna have to now spend hours yelling at that person and then maybe sourcing another product and going through the process of getting refunds on the other product and going through all of those types of things. which do I charge the client for that time? And realistically, the answer is yes.
Yes,
because
I have it now in my contract.
Exactly.
Time spent will be charged, it's billable.
Because otherwise, if the client didn't hire an interior designer, they would have had to do that.
Yes.
They're hiring you to solve those types of things. And if you're hourly based, that's time you're spending on their project. If it's something that's your fault, like you order something that's the wrong color, I wouldn't charge for something like that.
Yeah.
Or like something comes in and it's like, we ordered it online, we never saw it in person, and it's like, oh yeah, this is not going to work, and I recommended it, I'll be like, okay, I'll find something else, and I won't really charge for that time. But if it's something that's like unexpected for both myself and the client, it's like I have to bill for that time.
And I think that's where we can add in this piece of contingency planning as well. Like in that beginning stage of educating the client, we can always do our diligence and say, hey, like with the nature of COVID and how industries are being affected, it is beneficial for you to put aside a contingency budget to cover for these things, so that right from the beginning, the clients have that expectations ready. And that was something that I never used to do. So a little bit of a learning thing that I went through was that when I used to take on jobs, I paid very little attention to service agreements because I was excited to take on the job, get it signed. But then slowly, when my service agreement started getting a little bit better, I would just send it off to the client, hoping that they have read every line and term. And I sent it, but even that didn't work out for me. So now what I do, anytime I get an inquiry and there's, potential of signing the job on, I spend that 1 to 2 hours, free, just to sit down with my client and go through each clause. Do you understand the terms listed under furniture? Do you understand the terms listed in the return policy? And that's when they're like, oh, okay, all right, this and that. And then when they sign it, I'm good. So that 6 months later, as a problem comes, I can say, you and I sat down together and we read the contract.
Yeah.
So
no, I had to add that into mine too. And because I used to do the same thing, I would send it out and just be like, yeah, sign it back with the check or whatever it is. And it's like, they didn't read anything. They went to the last page and signed. And then it's like, I had a problem with the client once because in my contract, I put a sign in the front yard. It's marketing. It's whatever most designers do. And they had ripped it out the next day and it was at the side of the house. And I was like, it's in my contract that sits on your front lawn for the course of the project. And they were like, well, no, we don't want that. I'm like, it's in the contract. Yeah.
But that's the thing, it's an awkward conversation to have afterwards. It's like, but as per the contract, and
they're gonna be like, we don't care about the contract. So if you do spend the time, it's good practice to have to go through it with them so they do understand. And if there is those types of things, like unfortunately in that situation, I didn't end up putting up my sign because the project was more valuable than me having a poor relationship with the client. But it was unfortunate because that's a potential loss of business. Like somebody could have driven by and been like, oh, that house is being renovated by Conik Studios. Like
that's usually how word of mouth goes. And
sometimes if clients want to X that out of the contract, I'll say, yeah, we can X it out, but I have to add like a little bit of a fee because it's a loss of work for me.
Very interesting. And this is where you mean by nothing is standardized. You learn as you go and you do what works for you.
Exactly.
So we're going to talk about some best practices.
Okay.
Because that's information that designers want to gobble up. And since you started your business, I'm sure things weren't always peachy and you made mistakes and you learned from them. So where you are today, you are so successful. You're doing so great. Your work I've seen online is so beautiful.
Thank you.
We want to learn about some of the best practices that you've applied today in your process, not just the design work, but the process itself of managing a project from the beginning to the finish line smoothly.
For sure. I think going from working for a builder into going into my own practice, I think the first learning curve I had to go through was recognizing that interior design is a business and it's not just a creative field where you're making pretty things. It's like there's a whole business side of it where you're getting into contracts and there's legalities and liabilities and all of these types of things that you kind of have to learn about, because at the end of the day, like, we're not just doing it for fun, we are a business, we need to make money.
Exactly.
So that was a big learning curve for me, because I was always willing to kind of like take less to get a project, which you have to do in the beginning, but I would kind of let clients bully me a little bit and be like, well, I don't want to pay for that, and be like, oh, okay, don't worry about it. But now you kind of have to be like, well, no, like, I have a value, I have a worth, like, that's my fee, or that's what my commission is, or that's whatever you use to make up your...
But you had to build up to that, right?
I did.
Because initially, this is also another misconception I clarify with people, is I don't expect to be there right when you start off, because you don't have credibility. You haven't had any jobs under your belt to show. And even if you have a little bit of projects, like they will never, like you're trying to convince the client why they should put their trust in you. So at the beginning, it's okay to like let some of those things go.
You need to build a portfolio. Like a lot of our like how we get clients is proof of work. So we need to show that we've done work. So getting that first project, you may take a significant, like you could do it for free if you really wanted to. Like it could be your parents' house, it could be your own house, it may be a bedroom. Like you just really need to get that proof of work. And all of that, because obviously I had a lot of experience with the builder, but I couldn't use any of those projects as my own.
Right.
So I had to build my own portfolio and start taking kind of projects on that maybe I wouldn't have taken on, but I needed to build that portfolio. So that took years, like, and it's still evolving. We were just talking about how like every day our contracts are evolving because something else goes wrong. And it's like, oh, I need to write that in.
Yeah,
so it's covered in the next, if that ever happens again. And it goes back to the fact that it is a business. So that side of it and making sure that is all in place and strong and clients are aware and you have that kind of reputation where it's like you have your contract signed, you have your process in place, you have your documents in place, and you're going through. That allows you to have more fun with your client. So that took years for me to build, and like it's ever evolving. Like every time I take on a new client, it's like new.
So in that part of the beginning stage, I run into clients who are not email friendly, who, don't, like you can put those processes in place, like you said, like invoice due in the next 10 days, but they will surely not pay you in the 10 days. So how do you kind of discipline the client in making sure that they follow the things, even though they could be the most lovely people, but they're not following your process? Have you run into situations like that?
Absolutely, every time. Like I have a client right now and she loves to text, and it's in my contract that I don't text clients. I will if it's like I'm running late to a meeting or something like that, sure. But if you're going to send me 3 paragraphs in a text message, I'm not going to respond to it. And
that's a good point. You have that in your contract, right? Like it's understood.
It has to be in your contract, and that kind of gives you that kind of backbone to be like, it's in my contract. This is how I run my business. And otherwise, like things are going to get missed, things are going to get lost, because that's happened in the past where it's a client will be like, oh, I sent you a text. I didn't want the gray, I wanted the blue. And it's like, yeah, you sent it in a text and I went through all my emails and I couldn't find it. And it's like, I don't look at my text messages for that reason. Like I want everything documented in email. And getting into legality, it's always great to have things documented. And when they're all documented in that form, it's easier. And
have you found that the clients have like respected that in return, or?
I think if you do put your foot down, like you don't let it slide. Like if you let it slide and it's like 2 months into the project, you're like, I don't want to do this anymore. They're like, well, we've been doing it this whole time. That becomes more of a problem.
Right.
But if you put your foot down, especially with billing, I know clients are like, oh yeah, it's due in 10 days. And it's like on the 12th day, they still haven't sent you anything. And they're like, oh, I'll get it to you. And it's like, well, no, I'm a business. I need to pay bills. I bought this, or I've spent that time. I need to be paid for it. And if you have it in your contract, whether it's an additional fee, like some people add like a 1% fee per week or something like that, or some people are like, it's a stop work. If you stop paying me, it's a stop work. And you have to kind of enforce those for that to be respected, because if they're in your contract and you never enforce it,
that's the other thing. But you're saying like it can be a little difficult, but it's only gonna give you long-term relief, right?
It can give you a little.
Because I used to be very timid at the beginning. I was like, yeah, it's in there, but I never enforced it, to your point. But after you just get burned many times,
you kind of just have to say like, I'm not getting burned again, because it becomes like you want your company to be successful, and you can't take all these hits. Like if you do it on every single project, you're never going to make money. And so you do have to put your foot down a lot of the times, and you can do it. You don't have to be mean about it or aggressive. It's just like, no, this is in my contract and I am a business. And sometimes clients realizing that you are a business and you're not their best friend that they go shopping with.
Yes.
That's the biggest kind
I love
hurdle,
how you put that. Yeah.
But a lot of the times that's what it is. Like we'll go out on a shopping day where it's like we're doing all of the sourcing, and it's like, yeah, we get coffee and we get lunch and it's fun and we're friends, but then it's like, you just paid me for that. It's like it's still a business, so you have to kind of put that into perspective right away. Otherwise, it can get lost for sure.
And have you ever had to put out major fires in your jobs, and how did you go about doing that?
For sure, especially recently, I think the biggest thing is like trades and timelines, because people are like, you'll set an expected timeline where it's like, yeah, we'll be done in 6 months. But then it's like the plumber's supposed to be on site and you get a call and the plumber's not on site. And then it's like, oh, we have to find a new plumber and we have to do this. And that person's not there. And then it's weeks of like no work and you spending time trying to resolve all these issues. That's another thing that's in my contract now. It's like, if it's not at my fault and I still have to solve a problem, like it's a billable hour. So those types of hurdles have been really common recently. We were talking about furniture, like if it's ordered and it's like, oh, I need it on site. And then it's like, oh, well, we sold that piece. It's gonna be another 6 weeks. It's not really my fault that they sold the product. They didn't follow through with theirs. So I have to go after them and I have to spend the time and all of that type of thing. So those are more common hurdles right now.
But like you said, you just have to solve them as you go, because there's no rule that can apply to every situation. Like every situation is different, right?
Every situation is different. And I had a client just before the holidays in December. I had a client that I had been working with since September and it was just not going anywhere. And we were just wasting time. And every time I would meet with that client, it was just repetitive. And it's like, okay, we haven't made any decisions. Okay, we haven't made any decisions. And we weren't getting anywhere. And in that project, unfortunately, I had billed, because the client was more comfortable with it, I was billing based on deliverables. So I only got paid if I delivered something. And in 3 months, I never delivered anything because no decisions were ever made. So I couldn't deliver anything.
I feel the pain because that happens. There's jobs that are like 10% of the job is left and that 10% is just being dragged on. And to your point, it's been 3 months, hasn't been delivered. So how do you get your remaining 10%
Exactly,
paid, right?
Which is why I've switched exclusively to hourly, because I feel like it's the only mutually fair for client and business. It's like, if a client is going to be completely hands off, I never hear from them, and I can do everything and it takes me 10 hours, easy. They get billed for 10 hours. If a client's going to message me 17 times a day, change their mind 400 times, and it takes me 100 hours for the same project, it's only fair that they get billed for that 100 hours. I can't bill 10 hours for both projects because one took me way longer than the other.
I think everything that we've learned in this last bit of conversation is there's never a rule that applies to everything.
Never.
You learn per project, and not just learn, you adapt to the situation. So, there's a lot of like fear and intimidation around how do I set up my pricing or how do I set up my process? Well, you and I are here to tell them that it changes all the time. It's never consistent. It's always forever evolving, and that's okay. Like you shouldn't be upset that, oh man, like I have to now change my process yet again.
No, but I think you do need to, you're always going to be trial and error regardless. So I think you do need to have, regardless of if that process is successful or not, you need to have a process. If you walk blindly into a job and you're like, I'm just going to charge this amount of money and sign on the dotted line and hand me a check, and then everything goes wrong and you have nothing to kind of fall back on, you're going to get burned. So it's having a process regardless of is the important kind of piece of information for sure.
Well, we want to keep following everything that you're doing. So if people wanted to learn more about your business and all of the fun stuff you're doing, where can they find you? You
can find me at Conik Studios on Instagram, on Facebook. I try to post on Pinterest, but I'm terrible at it. That's kind of the best two places to follow us on. You can also follow us on our website. All of our Instagrams get uploaded to our website as well, and they kind of turn into a blog, www.conikstudios.com. And that's kind of the best places to follow along. And if there's a potential client who's watching this and they wanted to reach out to you, I always like to ask designers, do you prefer a phone call right away, or do you prefer an email? Like, what's the best way in sending your inquiry to? Regardless of how the client comes in, whether it's a phone call, an email, or we have a form on our website, I always turn that into a discovery call meeting. Right. So then that discovery call, once we figure out that we can work together, usually turns into a consultation. Perfect. Thank you so much, Marcus, for being here. We learned about a lot of great things, and we're going to stay in tune with everything that you're doing. Perfect. I appreciate it. Thank you.